We noticed that you're very active in Chinese microblog.
Well, the main thing which I discover is that huge numbers of lies are told on the Chinese Weibo. One, for example, which I had a polemic about, was completely false information was published about Russia. Now, Russia happens to be a subject that I know a lot about because I wrote an article in 1992 called Why the Economic Reform Will Succeed in China and Fail in Russia. That is probably the best known article I ever wrote. So therefore I know a great deal about it. So I knew immediately that the statistics given in this, and this was something that was written and circulated in 30,000 copies in China. This wasn't a question of opinion, it was the data was totally false, right? And I think therefore that I find a lot of things on that. For example, 18 months ago I was contacted by a Chinese newspaper and asked to write an article on what are the consequences for China of the US industrial revival. I said there are no consequences for China because there is no industrial revival in the United States. They said, well, that's not what we've heard. Everybody's writing about the Boston Consulting Group has written some big study saying there's a big recovery of the US industry. Okay, right, I know the figures. Right, at that time, US industrial production was 5% below what it was prior to the crisis. I wrote a Weibo about it now because I study this data every month when the US publishes. It's still 1.8% below. So far from there being a big US industrial revival, so far US industrial production has not even regained the level that it was prior to the crisis. So what I find rather astonishing on Weibo is the lack of, the writing of straightforward lies. This is the only way to describe it. Now, I think that there are two different types of economists who I disagree with. Right? Some I treat very seriously. For example, Milton Friedman. I don't agree with Milton Friedman. I can write things, but he's a very serious economist. He has very, very much data. And in fact, one of the interesting things is you can take Milton Friedman's own data to prove that he's wrong. Right? So that I respect, right? I don't respect people who have no facts, and I respect even less people who write lies. And I don't describe those people in nice terms because I don't think they do deserve to be described in nice terms. But I'd never use the same thing about Friedman or some of his people who are serious types, serious people, right? Okay. You have, for example, what's his name? I can't remember his Chinese name. Is Lang is the way I remember him. Who writes, there's a big industrial crisis in China and big recovery in the United States. But US industrial production in the last 5 years has increased, US industrial production by 0.5% and China's 71.8%. It's ridiculous to say that. So, this is the advantage, I would say, that the translation into from Chinese into English on the internet has so improved in the last 2 years that you can, for the first time, follow what's going on. And what astonishes me is just the amount of total lies and totally inaccurate information that is published on Weibo. And this is much worse, I would say, than anything in the West. In general, I prefer things in China, but you don't get that. The discussions which are conducted by the Financial Times, for example, do not consist of large amounts of falsified data. They have you can have difference of opinion, but the simple falsification of data is something rather specific to the sort of neoliberal circles in China. I would say that's the most striking thing I've learned.
So actually, the influence is quite negative.
Well, it's quite inaccurate. It's just lies. I mean, there's no other way to describe it, right? It's either it is very, very ignorant, that is, the people do not know the facts, right? Or they're deliberately telling things which are untrue, right? Again, we take the thing about Russia. The growth rate of China's GDP per capita is about 9.9%. The GDP per growth rate of Russia in the last 20 years is 0.8%. So therefore to present Russia as some great success is completely stupid. The person in this case apologised, because they said they hadn't checked the data. Well, sorry, but I think if you want to write about such a very, very important question, you know, the largest geographical country in the world, which is Russia, and the largest country by population in the world is China. This is a serious subject, right? If you want to express an opinion about the economic development of Russia or China, you should check your data, right? The person who wrote it didn't check their data. Then two very prominent people in China with millions of people Weibo also forward this data without checking it. One, to be quite honest, then said there's a mistake. Okay, but I think probably wasn't. Okay, that's fine. One has not really very said there was a mistake. But it's astonishing, you know, that this type of totally inaccurate information is, you know, it's put out. It's something special to China.
So the people who publish those obvious long figures, actually they are either ignorant or they do it deliberately.
Yeah, well, that's the only explanation, yes. If I want to be nice to them, I'll say they're ignorant. Mm-hmm. And if I want to be nasty to them, I'll say they're conscious liars, right? I'm not quite sure which is the case, but that's the only two explanations you can have, because this is not small details. You know, it's not like Russia grew at 8% and China grew at 9%, and you can have some argument about detailed question. Neither is it a question about economic theory of why the theory grew. This is just simply totally in false data, which is being published on Weibo. It's really quite uniquely Chinese.
So might ask you a question. If this kind of phenomenon happened in UK, for example, in Twitter account, they published some false economic figures through the Twitter, what kind of punishment they will have?
Well, people would know immediately. There would be very rapid response. Okay. Because you can't do it. I mean, that's one of the things now. I mean, you've got many people who write blogs, etc., etc. If you write false figures on Twitter, you'll be found out very quickly, right? I don't know, because people have done it. I mean, you know, people write wrong things, and I don't mean sometimes. Everybody makes mistakes sometimes. You know, if somebody makes an occasional mistake, etc. This is inevitable, right? You know, I deal with figures all the time. I know it's highly skilled to deal with that, right? But this is sort of false data which is published every single day, not occasionally by somebody.
But just now you have referred to the Weibo, which is about the Russians' problems. So also you have referred to the importance of GDP. So what do you think the relationship between the GDP and personal income?
It's almost total. There is no way to increase personal income without increasing GDP. If you take the world, 83% of income growth is due to GDP growth. That's just the world figure. So it means there is no way at all to increase income over any significant period of time without increasing GDP growth, right? Now, that affects many social phenomena. For example, one of the reasons that the discussion about Russia was so completely bizarre is the social consequences of the fall in GDP in Russia were terrible. Between 1992 and 1998, Russia's GDP fell by about almost 50%. Well, what were the social consequences? Male life expectancy fell by 2 years, right? As a man, I was somewhat concerned about this problem, right? The population of Russia today is lower than it was in 1992. There are many millions of people who are not there because they died young and because the birth rate collapsed. So in other words, it was not merely, is it false that Russia was a high income? The social consequences were terrible. This is one of the most important questions in the world because, of course, it's the question of whether the full privatization of the Russian economy carried out in 1992 was correct or not. That's why people want to falsify the data, because the data shows that the GDP growth of Russia after 1992 to now is 0.8% a year, less than 1%, right? Life expectancy is lower for males, female life expectancy roughly the same, but males, and the population is lower than it was in 1992. This is the elements of a social disaster, right? Okay. China's GDP growth was 9% a year, and life expectancies increased, health has improved. So in other words, the decision not to privatise the industries in China is entirely shown to be correct by what happened. That's why the people wanted to falsify the data about Russia. Because if you present the real data about Russia, it's clear that the privatization of the big state enterprises in Russia was an economic and social disaster for Russia. As they can't present the real data, therefore they falsified the data. Now in this case the problem is I happen to be an expert on the subject. So I could therefore write, the exact data about this until the point at which time they were forced to retreat, because I would have I've been writing about it, I could have gone on for 2 months, giving more and more data about this, right? Okay. So that's what the question is. There is no way to increase GDP, to increase income without increasing GDP. You see, and I've said it before, but the aim is not to increase GDP. Increasing GDP is just the means. I don't even think that the maximum rate, I would not set as the goal, the maximum rate of GDP growth. The exact formula I would give is the maximum sustainable rate of increase of the population's income. Why do I use the word sustainable? Because you can have very rapid growth that's damaging to the environment, and I think that's not a good idea. If the economy should grow, slightly less fast in order to protect the environment, then under some circumstances that is a correct choice. But there is no way for China's income to go up without rapid GDP growth. If you look at the income per capita, per person of China, it's less than 20% of the United States. Does the population of China always want to have only 20% of the income of the United States, only 20% of the living standard? I don't think so. I think that they want to have the highest living standard in the world, or at least as high as that. But that means the China's economy has got to grow enormously. China's economy has got to be about to do that, China's economy has to be about 8 times as big as it is now. That it means it has to grow at 8% a year for about 30 years to achieve that. And without that, there is no possibility to have very high standard of living. And I'm absolutely sure that the Chinese people are no different to anybody else in the world, that they want the highest possible living standards. So all this stuff about slow GDP growth and you can have high growth, it's just rubbish. There's no factual basis for it at all.